So I think it's checks and balances, and this is why it's so important to do things jointly, actually, that standards emerge jointly, not just one journal doing something that's sort of high risk. It's good as a proof of principle, but I think we should all move up fairly quickly with these things. Do you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Just to speak to what Richard was saying, I mean, I think these checklists are good, but if it puts off researchers from publishing because they haven't randomized or controlled their study, that is a real worry, because that will add to the publication bias of the literature. So we need to make sure, and there are plenty, what's remarkable is that funding agencies fund projects where they don't have these controls and processes of randomization in the first place. But if that study is done, it should be reported warts and all, so that the data and the information can be used within the context of how that study has been done, even if it's been done badly. And encouraging authors to publish this work and just be transparent about their reporting is, I think, the main thing. And to speak to checklists, it's not actually sure that even where there are checklists, they actually work in improving reporting. And there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done on seeing whether these types of things are effective in opening up the way that researchers report about their studies.
Great. Okay. So maybe we can also one more comment on the old perennial issue of why nature has a high retraction rate. I just want to add to the point that you made. It's simply also about visibility. If papers are published in journals that are more visible, more eyes are on them, and data will be deemed to be, well, it will percolate up as unreproducible much quicker than in other journals, I think.
There was also another study out last week which showed no correlation between impact factor and retractions. So, I mean, there's all sorts of...
But I think these things have to be really taken with a pinch of salt. They're not that meaningful. Okay, would you like to make a comment
on this, which in some way is a good thing, because if some of these papers would be published in the long-tail journals, it would prevail forever, that result. Nobody would care about it, and it would occasionally crop up and think. So by this measure, things are killed quickly. I think that's an advantage of this.
Okay, great. So one thing that I would like to discuss a little bit and hopefully get also some consensus on is the pre-publication versus post-publication roles of journals. At the moment, it's very much down to, because not many processes are in place at most journals, of publishing stuff and then reacting to anonymous or not usually anonymous whistleblowing comments and then trying to sort out the mess. Some journals have started to do pre-publication systematic screens, which are an expense and an investment. So the question is in how far it's actually a fundamental role of journals. Because we are doing peer review to quality control, and this is just, as you said, part of the plumbing of quality control. So in how far we should just accept that this is part of the investment we need to make and to charge for it, essentially, as simple as that. Is there consensus in the room that this is something we should all do as a concerted way, and maybe we can then develop joint standards to start to see how deep we should dig? Because of course, I mentioned briefly that we do image checking, image forensics. Elsevier mentioned that you started, you see less issues, we may spend a bit more time on it. You can dig deeper and deeper, and we barely scratch the tip of the iceberg with what we do. We just do a basically 30-minute basic contrast enhancement and so on every single figure that we wish to publish. But you could do much more analysis on the statistics and so on. So how deep should we go? Can we all agree to do it across all the journals? And can we agree to start charging for that? Maybe you can comment on what you would see from well, both of you. You can go.
Yeah, I mean, well, we are doing it obviously on Cell and looking at that on, as you say, high-profile journals. The problem is scalability because the technical tools aren't very strong at the moment. So it's a combination of trying to use technology, but also a lot of manual work, and it's those, frankly, those premium titles that have more staff and more investment that can, and also more at stake, to be honest, that can afford to do this. But we're certainly looking at ways of how do we scalably ramp this up. But also, as you mentioned, where do we draw the line? Where do you stop? Where's an acceptable point? And it extends beyond figures, of course. It's all about data. How do you peer review data? How do you check data? What do you define as peer review of data? So again, it tends to be a process of precedent, and when we make a step forward, we think about how we can apply that across all our journals. We tend to use the premium titles as the kind of the place where we start best practice, and if it works.
But you also don't have automation yet because I think it's largely manual process still for most of us.
Yeah.
Maybe Chris, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so scalability. So we thought that the plagiarism checking software would kind of do away with plagiarism, but then we realized we needed people to do interpretation of plagiarism checking software results. So we thought it was going to be super scalable, then we found that parts of it weren't really scalable. Image manipulation, with no automated tools at the moment. Perhaps there is a semantic kind of tool in development that can spot manipulation of images, but they will still need manual interpretation. They will still need to be looked at by a human being. So on the one hand, we find a way to scale. On the other hand, we know we have to devote resources. Another thing that I believe is happening at Nature, maybe somebody from Nature can talk to this, but checklists. We talked about checklists kind of for authors, but checklists for journals in the editorial process to evaluate whether the authors are reporting the things in the paper that they ought to be reporting. So the randomization, how that was done, the sample size, the kind of things that are very familiar for those of us who have worked in medicine, where Consort checklist asks authors to complete all of those things, but deployed instead in the life sciences and the biological sciences. That seems to me to be a sort of step in the direction of scalability and standardization, but still needs right now human intervention, which, again, is not scalable. So maybe we just have to admit that there are resources that need to be deployed, people who need to be employed to do some of this sort of stuff right now.
Maybe we can pick up on that also to just re-emphasize that a lot of these things are very field specific. So I come from the cell molecular biology community. If we had to pre-register all our experiments and apply proper statistics to what is done, we would basically publish maybe 1% of the papers we currently publish. So I think one has to go slow with these things. The community has to move at the same time as the journals with these things. So there has to be this interaction that was mentioned quite a lot between the scientific community and the policing. So one thing I wanted to get at too is the question of how to encourage. That came up. How do we encourage authors to come forward more? Because there's clearly an underrepresentation of retracted papers and corrections also. How do we encourage authors to come forward and self-correct? Clearly there has to be incentives to do that. The stick is not going to work in itself. So can research assessment start rewarding people that actually come forward? Is this something that's seen to be viable? Or is that just a romantic dream?
I think I hardly have a problem if I write to an author that he has to correct something and he comes up with a correction later. I think that's not a problem.
Sure, but that's stick. I mean, you're saying you have to do it.
It's not a big stick. It's just you ask the author to do that.
Sure.
And I think that's good practice that authors do that. I don't see that there's a lot of reluctance.
No, sure, but we're talking about that we're only scratching the tip of the iceberg with what we actually see. So authors clearly see much more, and which they don't come forward on. So it would be great if there was more of a culture of self-correction.
I think, okay. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I could add to that, because I think rewarding researchers for openness around a variety of activities and for correcting the literature and actually changing the incentive system so you're not only focused on the publication of the peer-reviewed article, but actually the activities that go round to making that research reliable and actually providing incentives around sharing, openness, transparency of reporting, and actually getting credit for it from your institutions and funders. And then it becomes to embed that within the culture of science. And then I think that's a sort of counter to the stick that we need to have, and also to give things like ORCID, which we've talked about before, being able to actually connect the researcher to different types of outputs. Constructive peer review is another one. We haven't really spoken much about that, but there's a lot of bias within that as well, and opening that up and making sure the right authors are getting credit for those types of activities.
So that's a note to funders also here.
Yeah.
It'd be great if you encourage that and put this into your research assessment protocols to start encouraging it. I see one of the problems at the moment is that you have an extremely blunt set of tools. So you have the tool of not reacting, of correcting, which is not very visible often. And then when things go more seriously wrong, you retract the whole paper. That means, you know, multiple authors are affected, all the science goes down. It messes up the scientific record when often only a very defined part of a paper is actually in question. So I would like to explore if there's other mechanisms you can suggest maybe that would address
so
that.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think the other role is that there has to be more direct collaboration with journals and with publishers and institutes. So for me, what was very illuminating was talking to the Chair of Ethics at Bristol and thinking about ways in which we could have joined up thinking, doing joint workshops to the postdocs in terms of saying, look, these are the consequences if you get it wrong, if you do malpractice. And sometimes it's done through ignorance. It's not just necessarily a sinister motivation there, but looking at much more ways of pointing out to them, look, there are consequences if you do this. B, more education, and C, getting institutes to work with publishers more. We're not just two separate silos. Both have reputations to lose, the journal and the publisher and the institute. So we're looking at more collaboration with academia on that.
But what about the point of, so my view of the situation is that at the moment the retraction is almost seen as the key punitive action that one can take. We're retracting the paper because that has a reputational damage. But if we want to encourage retractions, we're not going to achieve that by using it as a punishment, because then people won't come forward. So should we just remove the punishment element completely, and are there other ways to punish misbehavior? Maybe Richard?
Well, I mean, I don't see why journals are thinking about being police or punishers at all. Journals clean up the literature. So if a journal editor feels that table 2 is wrong and one author has not managed to satisfactorily answer the questions, there's definitely, is it a postdoc being thrown under the bus, you know, but there is that issue. But if the journal editor thinks, I've looked at this, I think table 2 is wrong, I think the results still stand, but this bit doesn't, you know, why not introduce versioning? Why not say version 1 is outdated, here's version 2? As for the punishment, I don't see how the journal editor can be the person to punish. I mean, we could talk about sharing with other journal editors or not, whether this particular person is a problem, but you know, that's a private thing, really. Punishment has to come from the institution or the funder or any other supervisory body.
And I don't think the role of retractions is to punish authors. And I think you mentioned this. The role of retractions is to correct, make a correction to the literature, and there needs to be that culture that it is acceptable to correct the literature. And that's
the problem de facto. It's not, because publishing is the currency, it's the reputational currency we have. So we have to, this again, it always comes back to research assessment at the end of the day.
And ultimately, I think what we have to do is separate, and this is going to be one of my solutions, separate evaluation from publication in some ways. And I think preprints are actually a potential game changer in that.
Okay, that's very important to note. So you talked about the different silos. So do you want?
I think there should not be any punishment if corrections are done, or even retractions based where honest mistakes involved. But only those retractions or correction, I mean, where fraud and fantasy, I would say, is involved, then there needs to be some punishment, perhaps then also at the institutional level and not so much from the journal.
Right. So this brings us to a very important point, which is who decides what an honest mistake is, and where we get more of a fraudulent behavior with intent to deceive, basically. Traditionally, it's seen that the institutions are the places where this should happen, and COPE has always suggested, as I understand it, that the journals should be in touch with institutions and actually sort of be downstream of that, wait for institutional reports and then act in consistently with that. At least in our experience, that can work. It can cause major delays, but it also sometimes causes huge problems, because institutions have not always done a competent job, or have even gone beyond that and have done an incompetent job, I would say. In other words, there's sometimes an inherent tension that's very clear. If a senior person, if the institute director, for example, is on the paper, it's extremely hard for an institution to be completely neutral. So this comes back to the issue that was raised in several presentations of a bigger structure, an international court. Or are there any other mechanisms we can think of? Should COPE grow into something like this?
Well, just to make it very clear, the COPE flowcharts for dealing with any kind of misconduct or inappropriate behaviour almost always start with asking the author what was going on, and always include a step that is to talk with the institution. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't a case for unilateral action on behalf of a journal when the journal is convinced that the evidence is complete, they've got the whole picture, and they need to take a corrective step. So journals can act unilaterally, but I think in most instances they need to act with the institution. COPE realizes this. So that stool, one of the legs, if COPE is the stool, it's currently got some journals in it, a large number of journals, a large number of publishers, and no institutions. So we're working out how to attach the leg to the stool that is the institutional leg to bring everybody together, principally, and then maybe we can work out how to deal with it. I don't think that COPE can work out a solution without institutions present, for sure. So that would be the first step.
Right. Okay. One important issue, and we're going to open up the discussion in just a second. One important issue that I am quite interested in is the issue of reproducibility, which, and I would like maybe comments on how far do you see that related to misconduct? Is reproducibility more an issue of sloppiness, lack of doing things properly, or is there often an intense selective reporting? Or is it down to the journals not being fit for purpose, of simply not having proper method sections, protocols, identifiable reagents, etc.? What's the main driver of the reproducibility problem that we apparently seeing?
I think it's the culture to publish positive results, essentially. And so everything is framed within that context. And so I don't think it's deliberate misconduct. I think it goes back to that sort of quote I gave at the beginning, is that when your career depends on it, you go looking for the patterns that fit. And that's,
So what intervention would you recommend? I mean, of course, it's legitimate that journals like Nature are selecting for milestone breakthroughs which tend to be positive. Of course, it's great that PLOS ONE is now filling a gap here, a very important gap of publishing negative data, but to expect now Nature to publish data irrespective of the...
Well, I think, again, it comes back to separating the evaluation of interest and impact from publication. So there's no reason why Nature or scholarly societies can't take a paper that is already publicly available and say, yep, it's got the Nature stamp, or it's got the British Ecological Society stamp, or whatever. But actually publishing it, the work should be... the incentive for researchers should be to make that work reliable and reusable. And I think that would be the first thing. And that's why I think preprints will actually, and although they've been taken up by the physics community, they haven't really been embraced yet by the biomedical community. But actually publishing something earlier, before that official barrier of peer review, I think will help ameliorate some of these problems. It will speed up publication. It will still enable precedence. It will also enable many eyes to look at that work, to look at things like figures and reporting and things, before it gets to that, perhaps an additional step about how interesting is this paper, how important it is. And I think that going along or trying to get the culture to shift that way would be more constructive.
So what's holding back people publishing on preprint servers in biology, you think?
I think it's the absolute fundamental reputational and financial incentive to publish in the existing
But we
journals.
have now moved beyond the journal policies blocking that. I think it's fair to say that there's almost no journals now that block preprint server pre-publication.
No, they don't.
It's a cultural.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing, I think, yeah.
Right. Okay. I have a few more detailed questions, but I think at this point it would be useful to also get sort of more bigger conceptual questions from the audience. Would anybody like? Okay, that's in the back.
Thanks. So Phil Jones again from Digital Science. I see two possible ways of looking at this issue in terms of researcher behavior. One is that we have got a few bad apples who are breaking the rules and doing the science incorrectly, possibly fraudulent, possibly just sloppy. And then the other sense, the other side of the coin might be that there are a lot of researchers who are just ever so slightly reducing the level at which they do the science. Everything's getting a little bit sloppier. The perverse incentives are causing a gentle downward pressure. So to borrow Kent's analogy, is this a wide problem or a tall one?
No, that's an important point to emphasize again, and there's a huge amount of conflation also with the press often, and everything is immediately deemed to be fraud, basically. And it's very important to emphasize, and I think in your public communication, I think a strong message would be to always really emphasize that we're talking about apples and oranges with these things. There's a tiny minority of outright fraud, and I would even pose that almost no scientist enters science to commit fraud. This simply doesn't exist. It's usually down to some sort of breakdown or pressure. The real issue that we can address, because fraud has always been there, the real fraud, the tiny amount of real fraud, it's always been there, it's pathological. That's very hard to address, but what we can address is the slippery slope, I can't remember the Kent word for that, but the broad thing, that's where we can make a big difference, and that's where we should focus, I would say. Is that something that's reasonable?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, there's a couple, maybe in the back first, and then we go to the front.
I'm Kaveh from River Valley Technologies. I'm going to get myself into big trouble here, but I'll take the risk. I've got a few things I wanted to say, but Katrina put her finger on, she scooped what I was going to say just now, about, for example, having a lot of eyes on figures. The more I listen to discussions the whole of today, the more I feel that the tradition of reporting scientific progress through a publication, which we all think of as this double column paper with abstract and what Jeffrey Bilder was showing, it simply is wrong. It is slowing down scientific progress. We are getting in the way of quick scientific communication. What I have in mind is that if I discover something in the lab, I tweet it or I write it onto some sort of platform, or the platforms that we're talking about. People come in and contribute to that, criticize that. Immediately they'll see if I've sort of faked something or if I made a mistake. Then we get down very quickly, science is disseminated. I can't be scooped. The publication, that's very important, with beautiful typesetting, with beautiful PDFs, which I love, and with the right copyediting, comes after that, and it'll be a perfect publication. So the role of publishers is absolutely there, but not for reporting scientific progress. I'm in big trouble, I know, but there's a door at the back I'm going to run out of here.
No, in principle, you're of course absolutely right. I think the problem is the reality. So we're already dealing with, and you can comment on this too, a couple of million published peer-reviewed papers a year now. The scalability is simply not there, and we see from the evidence of post-publication and pre-publication commenting that it's actually very sporadic at best, and it's not always the most incisive comments that one sees. It's nowhere near the quality of what one gets from referees, from peer reviewers, for example. The problem is the volumes of information we're churning out makes it extremely difficult to expect, if we share everything in real time, that we have appropriate filters, I think, for quality control. So we have to be careful that we don't sink into a morass of semi-reliable information. Nobody knows anymore what the quality of that information is. Yeah.
I would fully support what you say, and also comment on the speed issue. I think it certainly is a healthy thing that we have a lot of competition among publishers, among editors, among journals, and it depends perhaps on fields. But in the field I'm an editor in chemistry, it's very competitive with the American Chemical Society, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and some of the other publishers on the floor here. And I think everything goes out below, on average, 60 days in my environment. And there are many papers even faster. And this is something, perhaps in other fields, it might, I hear 120, 140 days or something like that. If we reject, okay, it takes another round somewhere else. I think more recently, publishers have engaged in cascading journals so that you don't start all over from scratch. So the referee reports that are already there from one journal can be used at another journal, and it might take much shorter than to get something out than perhaps 10 years ago.
Richard?
So I just wanted to add, I don't think that what Kaveh was saying reduces the role of the need to have the narrative, as he was saying, and the quality narrative. And it might be that there's a morass of, we already see a morass of preprints on archive, which, you know, the astronomers and the physicists look at, they're in the field, and everyone else maybe doesn't know what to look at. And then when it comes to publication in a journal, that is still a filter quality, and it's still up to the journal at that point to say, have you done the things that make this a good report? And if you haven't, do that. And so the advantage of the preprints is the speed of publication, but it doesn't reduce the role of the publisher at all.
But it's worth emphasizing. That's why, I think the preprint layer is actually a really successful layer because you're talking about tweeting and so on, and I think that is without barriers. The preprint has a basic level of quality control instituted. And the question is, there's no business model for this yet, but there is some quality, some checks and balances.
Well,
and I think that's important.
Archive has a very successful business model in that it gets paid, $800,000 a year from the Simons Foundation and lots of contributing libraries, and it puts all this up at $10 a paper and filters slightly, and bioarchive the same. But also, Kaveh, I mean, many science papers are never cited. Most arts and humanities papers are never cited, and you can be sure that most preprints will never be seen. But I suppose it doesn't matter if they're out there and the quality filtering comes later.
It's an important element that they're citable and stable units, and that self-selects to some extent because people know they can't just remove the stuff. So there is a sort of barrier to just posting anything, and I think on social media that's not there, so one has to be careful.
And I saw a talk from someone at Archive, and actually, although you're right, most papers don't get cited, for physics papers put on the archive, they're cited much sooner and they achieve higher citations even when the paper is actually published. So there's a massive citation advantage. And so I think the main thing is were we to invent scholarly communication today, we wouldn't invent journals, probably. We might invent communities of practice and different ways of doing things, but we're sort of stuck with trying to shift a system into a digital age that wasn't made for it. And I think preprints and getting more eyes and having additional layers, so I'm not saying get rid of peer review at the journals at the journal level, but having preprints with additional layers of eyes and more open communication of science much earlier on is the way to help shift that system.
I think there's also a proliferation of different types of content. So, particularly in medicine, you have like the visual journals that are just publishing new images. We talked about Cortex doing the registered reports. So I think it's not just preprints. I think there's many more things that we can do to address that. And also just to reinforce the point that, there are now quite a good number of journals that can publish within 24 or 48 hours. So I think speed is being competitively addressed by publishers. That's not to say I'm complacent, but...
We have another question.
It's Fred Dillo from AIP. I'd like to address a question to our esteemed science journalist on the panel. Hi, Richard. How are you? So a science journalist has a very important intermediary role between the scientific community and the public. And in general, when there's been a high-profile case of scientific fraud or a highly cited scientific paper from a highly cited scientific journal retracted, there's a lot of bad press. And it gets misinterpreted. We've all seen the cover of The Economist. It says, science is in big trouble. Well, science is not in big trouble. You cited the error rates, even the retraction rates we're 10 times higher. It's a smaller error rate in any other form of communication. Take the esteemed New York Times. Half of the front, back, second page are the errors for the previous edition. Okay? Now those are errata and they're not retractions. But it's, for the most part, a self-correcting communication mechanism. How do you, as a science journalist, when you have to report, like to report on a sensational case because it drives the news cycle, how do you work with your colleagues in the trade press so they understand that science is not in trouble, it's self-correcting, the bad apples are small, and the case of the bad apples is very different than the reproducibility issues. The reproducibility issues because of the difficulty of biology and medicine. We have, in my career in physics, I can think of 2 bad cases in 50 years. It's just a lot easier to do a physics experiment than it is to make a cancer cell line. So how do you, in your role of this interpretation between the science community and the public, get a handle on that problem?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of anguish among science journalists about this question. There's a lot of calling out of other science journalists for bad journalism, and there's a few websites, I think Gary Schwitzer's Health News Review, hope I've got his name right, that look critically at the quality of science reporting. And the problem with that, I guess, is that the people who are not doing it well are usually not doing it well because they lack time. So it's slightly unfair to compare the New York Times, which is made afresh every day with reports coming in every hour to a journal, which has hopefully spent much more time evaluating research, which itself took a lot of time to put together. But so the problem is that the good science journalists, the science journalists that like to think of themselves as responsible, know that they cannot necessarily haul up the other science journalists who may have to write 5 stories in a day for a newspaper that is not so concerned about getting everything correct and wants the sensationalism. So although there's lots of anguished blog posts and forums and science journalist meetings worrying about how to improve the standard of science journalism and training courses, this problem is still going to exist and it's never going to go away because the media is a different beast to a journal. Maybe the media is not a very good place to report science news, but just saying that is not going to stop it happening. So what tends to happen is that journalists hate being embarrassed and called out, so public calling out of bad journalism, critiquing is a very good way to go. And the beautiful thing about social media and Twitter and the internet is it's never been easier to publicly embarrass a journalist for bad reporting or call out a newspaper for getting something wrong. So we have that benefit now that we didn't have 15, 20 years ago. So I can assure you that there is a lot of self-examination among science journalists, but the people who do that self-examination are usually the ones that get it wrong less often. So Ed Yong has a great post that you may have seen called every science versus journalism debate in one picture, and it sort of says, the good scientists blame the bad journalists, and the good journalists pick out the bad scientists, and they forget that each other exists, and the bad guys aren't listening, they're in the pub. So there is that inevitable problem. It usually comes down to time for journalism. If you have enough time, you can get lots of comment, you can effectively run your own peer review on a situation, then you'll produce a good report. But if you don't have enough time, then it's going to be very, very difficult. But I don't think that with journals that urgency exists so much. So I don't see that as so much of an excuse. But the problem is there, and I can point you to lots of resources and angst about it.
So Arno's amazing, powerful new policy of German champagne at the end of the conference is clearly working very well. But it's before we lose people, I wanted to come back to one. By the way, German champagne is illegal, so we have to find a different way to label that. So we have to find one thing I really wanted to get feedback on is anonymous commenting versus curated comment. So non-curated, curated commenting, and anonymous commenting versus declared commenting. Since there was a vacuum, since there's been clearly a very strong vacuum, at least in the biological sciences, on whistleblowing, if you wish, there's a website that's emerged into the space that COPE has been occupying, really, which is called PubPeer, which has a huge amount of information, and it's growing even faster than exponential. And it's essentially, for us, it's a full-time job now just to read the papers that are being called out on this entirely anonymous commenting platform. And I would just like to see if there's any views in the room on what journals should do. Should they allow anonymous commenting? Should they curate commenting? Why is the commenting on journals so low compared to PubPeer, which is going through the roof? Is there any views on that?
So we receive anonymous comments, and we certainly try then to identify if there's something behind, but we forward that to the author. We try to follow up on this. Is there something behind it? And if needed, corrections are following if nothing comes out of that. So we follow up on anonymous as well as open comments.
That's true for us too. Yeah. But what about PubPeer as a platform taking on almost this role of a clearinghouse of problematic information?
Well, so COPE has to engage with PubPeer. COPE is mentioned on PubPeer where a particular an individual has got a particularly sharp axe to grind and has already brought that axe to COPE and found that they're dissatisfied with what COPE has found. So we have to engage with PubPeer. COPE is kind of into attributed sources, right? So likes people to name themselves. And COPE's approach is to try and retain a balanced and neutral and professional voice in all of this. It's really easy to get shouty and hysterical on the internet. That's not COPE's job. COPE's job is to be balanced and neutral and professional. So when you see the hysteria on PubPeer, as you sometimes do, mixed in amongst the good stuff on PubPeer, there's always a judgment call about whether to engage or not.
So would one solution be to do like angewandt Chemie and actually encourage commenting that's not anonymous to the editors, who then preserve the anonymity, but at least then you have some level of authentication, basically, of the comments that are being made. Now it's really free for all. You can do any level of backstabbing you want, very publicly. Is that the right solution to the problem?
Well, I don't think it's a case of finding a solution, because I don't think you're going to be able to stop it.
No.
It's a social phenomenon.
Well, but you can provide alternatives that are viable, which don't exist right now.
Well, I think people are reluctant to leave comments on official journals. They don't want to leave their name, they want to leave a comment, because often it's something they're not sure about themselves.
No, but the comments could be anonymous, but the journals can authenticate, basically, at least the origin of the
They
content.
can also use editorial. They can use the editorial channel and basically have a dialogue with the editor, and that can be confidential. And then they can agree, if at a later date, if they want to go open with or disclose that discussion. So I hope most journals operate that with the editor, would have private correspondence. What I do think is a good idea is, and I think you suggested it, is to publish every year or do an assessment of the number of complaints received by a journal, and I hate to use the term misdemeanors, but reports of malpractice or whatever. And I think if we do that evaluation, I think you do begin to see patterns. And I think that's a no-brainer thing to do for publishers, actually, on some key journals.
And for those evaluations, it would be nice to know something like, when an evaluation was raised, how quickly did the author respond? One of the problems was what happens when the author doesn't respond. To a reporter, the answer is easy. I simply write in my report, they didn't respond, and I've called them out on it, and the fact is they didn't respond, and that's reduced the reader's confidence in that person. So that would be interesting to know as well.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that journals need to do is to watch what happens on PubPeer and then do something in response, right? So if there is a debate around a piece of published research that is founded in good sense on PubPeer, then it's the journal's job to make sure that they're doing something about correcting what they've published. That doesn't mean that they should take the PubPeer to be an official investigation, right? They need to then look at their own records and investigate themselves. But it can be a useful flag for items that need action.
But when you talk about the journal, there's a slight ambiguity, is there not? Because are you talking about the publisher or the editor? And of course, then you've got the whole issue of editorial independence. So a publisher may raise the fact that something's going crazy on social media with the editor may feel very uncomfortable about engaging with that for very valid reasons. So that's the, I think we have to remember that.
But maybe a compromise, which might be something that applies to everyone here, that would be good, is rather than just engaging with it, because there is a level of paranoid hysteria there one sometimes sees, to just put a placeholder in saying, we are looking at this, by the way. So give us the time, because it does take time. That's what's often forgotten. They want a response in 2 days.
Yes.
But just to put a placeholder in, we've seen this, we're looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing.
So
I think
that's something we should.
Social media, the hysteria means that people, you feel the right thing to do is respond quickly, and actually something might merit quite deep investigation. And I think it's wrong to think that just because there's no response means that it's not being taken seriously. And I think that's, I mean, you're right, we could put a placeholder. But my concern is responding. Sometimes it can take months to go into something. You have to consult independent advisors and other referees, etc. And I think that due process needs to be followed, I think.
One issue, I see Arnold writing some messages. It probably says end, stop or something. Thank you. Okay. So one issue that it's more prosaic, but I think it would be useful to quickly discuss. If there's a common standard we can agree on, how to communicate corrections and retractions. There's clearly a lack, and Cope has made this point very prominently, there's a lack of transparency. There's usually far too little information to actually track what happened. So is there, what we started, for example, doing is to always have an author statement and an editorial statement to give sort of both sides of what happened.
I actually think that the guidelines, the recommendations from Cope, but also from Retraction Watch and others about what to put into a retraction statement are pretty clear. I think that they're clear enough to allow interpretation. So there are occasions where you don't want to be as transparent for perhaps legal reasons as you would like to be, but they are pretty clear. So
well, they're clear, but people are not adhering to them. So,
so
maybe in this room we could all sort of agree to adhere to them.
Retraction Watch is policing that by calling out good examples of poor retractions, and encouraging change there. So, so good on your Retraction Watch.
Okay, so maybe that's a take-home message.
Good point. I think everything is clear in principle. We have all these advice from the publishers. We have Cope. Everything should be clear, but still every day there's malpractice. So we deal with humans, and so it's a never-ending battle.
I just want to talk about the anonymous and non-anonymous commenting, because PubMed Commons also provides a venue for comments. Those aren't anonymous. A lot of them are incredibly constructive, and I think the appeal of anonymity is the ability to make a comment without retribution. And even within when we receive complaints at PLOS, we sometimes receive anonymous comments. We sometimes receive comments from a known person that is very scared of their name being revealed to the person who they're complained about. And there needs to be some protection for whistleblowers and a trusted space. And I think journals can help mediate that. And also for anonymous commenting, the culture is such that researchers feel there will be repercussions against their career if their names are made. And I think this all comes back again to the existing culture of science. I mean, actually, we're having a discussion about some of this at the IASPA conference this year. Hilda Bastian from PubMed Commons is coming to talk in Washington.
So maybe one take-home message is, if your journals have policies against acting on anonymous comments, you should drop those, because it is understandable that some people want to be anonymous. Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions from the floor? I don't want to keep you in your seats for too long. Okay, here in the third row.
Alexander from PaperHive, Berlin.com, which is tackling some of the issues just mentioned, both preprints and discussions on papers published or not. Would you agree that one of the reasons why there is not enough commenting happening on the publishers' web pages is that they are actually siloed? So, say a researcher who wants to research in medicine who wants to comment on one journal has to log in this publisher's portal and then in the next ones.
Anybody want to? maybe.
Yeah, I'll talk to that. I think that commenting across all publishers' platforms is the sensible thing. There are some things like, well, you know, ORCID, etc., that need to be a one solution across all. And I think that's why PubPeer works. You know, it's one place where you can go and you can comment on anything that's been published. It's not, well, it's not about the silo or the paywall. It's just about the place where everything gets talked about. So that's a useful thing.
So you could re-aggregate the comments made on the journals, maybe on the platform.
Maybe you could, and maybe that's a business model for PubPeer.
And maybe that's what will solve this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but you're absolutely right. I think that is off-putting that people have to pre-register. The reason journals do that is because they want to have a certain level of professionalism in the commenting. If you open it completely up and don't police it, the chances, and these things are persistent. I mean, they're really associated very deeply with the paper, and if they're unprofessional, then it can damage actually a paper, even if they're unfounded, they still damage the paper, I think.
And you also very quickly run into legal issues, obviously, which PubPeer avoids.
Yeah, good point. Okay, any other? All right. Any statements from the committee, discussion panel?
I would like to make...
Have we solved any problems?
I think we have. I would just like to make one appeal, because I do think there needs to be some kind of international body that sets the standards for ethical reporting across all of science. I think juggling between multiple different legal frameworks from different countries where certain practices are acceptable or unacceptable.
So that's a great way to end. If you could maybe email us your support or otherwise for this recommendation, because I'm entirely in favor of this too.
I don't know who takes it on.
No, but the first step would be to see if there's any interest in this or any need for it, and then we should approach some of the COPE can do it, but we need also some of the funders in the room to cough up the infrastructure for your second secretary to run it.
Just one more, we'll manage.
So it would be very useful to get your feedback on this issue, which is would be a new fairly sizable infrastructure that we need to develop. I would just like to point out that the Office of Research Integrity in the US has, I think, 9 full-time employees, and they manage to do 15 cases a year or something. So it's very, very expensive to do this properly. So, but do send us your questions and comments in on issues. This is a hugely important topic, I think, and it would be useful if we could maybe circulate those also to the rest of the attendees here to try to move things forward. And maybe in the next year we could, because I see there's something about 2017 on that note here, we could have a report of anything that happened in the meantime. Thank you very much for attending.